Elder Scrolls lore is full of gods, monsters, and heroes, and most of the time it is easy to tell which is which. A god lives in oblivion and grants power to cultists. A monster lives in a cave and eats travelers. A hero picks up a sword and goes and does something about it. But there are 15 beings in this world who don't sit still inside those categories. Some of them are half one thing and half another. Some of them used to be a place, or a star, or an idea, before they became something closer to a person. Some of them are gods who don't believe they are gods, and heroes who might be 5 heroes wearing one name. What follows goes through them roughly in order, from the ones that are strange because of what they are, to the ones that are strange because of what was done to them, ending with a being who is, by most accounts, the strangest thing Tamriel has ever produced twice over. Start with Vivec. Vivec was one of the 3 living gods of Morrowind, worshipped for thousands of years as the warrior poet, the god king of Vardenfell, and the guardian standing between the Dunmer people and the dark powers sleeping under Red Mountain. He is usually grouped with Almalexia and Sota Sil as the Tribunal, the trio that ruled Morrowind as gods after the Battle of Red Mountain. What makes Vivec strange starts with something simple. He looked like 2 different people at once. His people had once been Chimer, golden-skinned and gold-eyed, before a curse from the Daedric prince Azura turned them into the grey-skinned, red-eyed Dunmer. When that curse landed, Sota Sil kept his Dunmer look, and Almalexia went back to her old Chimer look. Vivec did neither. He chose to keep half of each, one side of his body Chimer and the other side Dunmer, so that his own face carried the 2 halves of his people's history at the same time. He said he did it so he could separate the old temple from the new one, the bronze from the blue. Whatever the reason, he spent the rest of his long life as a walking argument for the idea that a person doesn't have to be only one thing. His titles carried the same split. He was called the Magic Hermaphrodite, the Martial Axiom, and the Child of Truth and Falsehood, on top of the more heroic names like Warrior Poet and God King. Later in his life, after events that will come up shortly, he picked up one more title that fit the pattern: Mother Father of Monsters. He also spent that life writing. His best-known work is a set of texts called the 36 Lessons, and calling them strange undersells it. They are cryptic on purpose, written as a guide for a hero, the Nerevarine, who hadn't even been born yet when Vivec wrote them. Scholars and players have spent years picking through the lessons, trying to work out what they actually mean, and nobody fully agrees. The text itself is described as wide open to an incredible amount of speculation and guesswork. That isn't a flaw in the research, it is the point. Vivec wrote something meant to be argued over for centuries, aimed at someone who didn't exist yet, and it worked exactly as intended, because people are still arguing over it. Some readings of the lessons claim to have found something hidden underneath that cryptic surface. According to those readings, taking the first letter of every paragraph in one particular sermon about the Battle of Red Mountain spells out the words foul murder. Another sermon is said to hide a second message the same way, one where Vivec appears to confess, in his own words, that he wasn't born a god, that he chose his path freely, and that he stole his own godhood and killed the Hortator Nerevar with his own hand. Whether that reading was actually intended or is simply a pattern readers found inside a text built to reward exactly that kind of searching isn't something the lessons ever explain. They just sit there, cryptic either way. The lessons are also said to have predicted the rise of an emperor who wouldn't be born for centuries, describing a coming 2-headed ruling king alongside his closest advisor and giving that pairing the title the Red Jewel of Conquest. Later readers have connected that prophecy to Tiber Septim, the man who eventually united all of Tamriel under one banner, and to his own battle mage, a strange, enigmatic figure whose true nature would go on to become one of the most disputed identities in all of Tamrielic history. That dispute belongs further down this list. For now, it is enough to know that Vivek's cryptic text seems to have been pointing at it centuries before it happened, in exactly the same riddling, unresolved way it points at everything else. Vivek's end is stranger than his life. Near the close of the Third Era, he lost his divinity. That part alone isn't unusual for a god in this setting. What is unusual is that the record is fairly clear. He didn't lose it by accident and didn't lose it fighting off some outside enemy. He helped bring it about. The sources describe it as a sacrifice he accepted and then helped engineer himself. A god who worked toward his own fall on his own schedule without being forced into it isn't the ordinary shape a god story takes. But before any of that, there is the strangest single episode in Vivek's history, and it comes from the sermons, which aren't some fringe text whispered about by outsiders. They were mainstream religious literature in Morrowind, read and taught as scripture for the tribunal temple, one of the largest religions on the continent. According to the sermons, Vivek married the Daedric prince Molag Bal. It wasn't a secret affair or a myth kept quiet. It was recorded, discussed, and taught as part of Vivek's own divine history. The union produced children, thousands of them by some counts, and the children were monsters. Most of them were hunted down and destroyed, some by Vivek's own hand, using a spear he made and named for the purpose. But one of the children got away. It rose up into the sky and became a meteor. That is as far as this part of the story needs to go. Where that meteor ended up and what it later did belongs to another story entirely. For now, the plain fact stands on its own. One of Tamriel's living gods married a Daedric prince, had monster children with him, and one of those children is still up there somewhere as a rock in the sky. The story behind that marriage has its own strange shape. Vivek had gone out into the Ashlands to practice a giant form of himself when Molag Bal came to him with a proposal, and Vivek didn't refuse. He asked for a proper ceremony instead. Molag Bal obliged by making pomegranates spring up out of the Badlands, and a group of Khmer mystics came out to read scripture over the occasion. Vivek agreed to let only his head attend the actual rite, since the rest of him still had teaching left to finish with Nerevar, and in exchange for the ceremony, Molag Bal gave him a new word of power. The union itself lasted 88 days, with the rest of Vivek's body lying with Molag Bal on the ruined ground of Bal-Ur, the very place where Molag Bal himself had once been tricked into becoming mortal in the first place. When other Khmer, demons, and monsters who witnessed the act tried to copy it, the ground itself split open and spat out an entirely separate race of destructive creatures as a side effect of the imitation. Vivek came away from the affair with a secret of his own, which he used to reforge his spear into a new weapon named Muatra, meaning milk taker, a blade that could touch anyone and leave them barren and withered down to bone. It was with that weapon that Vivek hunted down and destroyed most of what the marriage had produced, and drove Molag Bal himself back into oblivion in the process. The name Vivek's own sermons use for Molag Bal in this part of the story is blunt: the King of Rape, a title tied directly to the claim that Molag Bal wanted to ruin the Dunmer gene pool, wording that comes straight out of the old text called the House of Troubles. The Tribunal Temple, separately, called him the Father of Monsters, a plainer label pointing at the same set of events. Both titles describe the same marriage from the same religion's own records. It isn't an outside enemy's insult. It is what Vivek's own faith called the God that faith's own God had married. How Vivek's fall from godhood actually happened is disputed in the same way almost everything about him is disputed. One account has him standing trial before a council in the imperial city over the tribunal's old theft of divinity from the three good Daedra, only for Vivek to trick that same council into summoning Azura, bind her the moment she appeared, silence her with the same weapon he had used on Molag Bal, and banish her from Tamriel out of pure spite before vanishing without a trace. That is one version among several, none of them confirmed, and the sources don't agree on whether Vivek died at that point, simply disappeared to some unrecorded plane to go on thieving for his own amusement, or lingered on in some diminished form for years after. What the sources do agree on is the general shape. Whatever happened to end his godhood, Vivek wasn't simply overpowered by some outside enemy. He walked toward it himself on his own terms, right up to the point where the record loses track of him entirely. There is a strange coda to that whole dispute, regardless of which version actually happened. Once the tribunal fell for good, the Dunmer people didn't stay leaderless in matters of faith. Their new temple went back to worshipping three good Dadra as what they now call the Reclamations. And one of those three is Azura. The very goddess one version of the story has Vivek binding, silencing, and banishing out of pure spite on his way out the door. If that version is true, the Dunmer ended up back in the arms of the god their own departing living god had spited hardest. For most of his reign, before any of that decline set in, Vivek was the most publicly visible of the three living gods, especially among ordinary people living on Vardenfell. He is said to have performed something like 100 miracles a day as a regular habit, so often that his fellow tribunes occasionally chided him for showing off his own power so casually. On at least one occasion, he is said to have gone out and worked a poor farmer's field himself after the man's guar had died, simply because the farmer needed the help. That is the same being who married a Daedric prince, fathered an army of monsters, and hunted most of them down with a spear he built for the purpose. Both versions of Vivek are on the record side by side, and nothing in the sources asks which one is the real him. Long before any of that, in the war that first made his name, Vivek fought enemies just as strange as anything he later became himself. Alongside Nerevar, the Khmer hero he served as counselor, Vivek faced down a run of Nordic chieftains who each carried their own bizarre gift from the Thu'um, the ancient power of the voice. One chieftain could give storm clouds, stomach aches, and turn falling rain into bile. Another could reshape the very outcome of any battle just by singing, until Vivek silenced her by stuffing her own mouth shut with what the old accounts call his milk finger. A third could eat the soil of the battlefield itself and breathe it back into fallen soldiers to revive them. Vivek, alone among the Khmer and Dwemer standing against them, could actually understand what the Nordic chieftains were shouting at each other, and used that understanding to talk one of them to death in open debate rather than fight him with a blade at all. Long before he married a Daedric prince or lost his divinity on his own terms, Vivek's reputation was already built on facing down enemies whose very existence broke the ordinary rules of what a soldier could do on a battlefield. The marriage to Molag Bal wasn't even the only time Vivek fathered a race of monsters. On a journey he took with Nerevar that carried the two of them across the sea to Akavir, then north into frozen lands, and finally west to Yokuda, Vivek chose a Yokudan king as a wife and produced yet another race of monstrous offspring, one that, according to the accounts, went on to help destroy the entire western part of the world. It is mentioned almost in passing in the old sermons, tucked between one leg of the journey and the next, as though fathering a civilization-ending race of monsters were simply one more stop on the itinerary. Between that and the children born of Molag Bal, monstrous offspring weren't a single strange event in Vivek's life. They were something closer to a recurring hazard of being married to him at all. Later, when the ash vampire Dagoth first returned from what is remembered as a centuries-long sleep beneath Red Mountain, Vivek led a column of Dunmer refugees away from the resulting devastation to the safety of a city called Gnisis. Exhausted, Vivek and his followers fell asleep there, and woke to find themselves frozen solid inside casts of ash. Unable to help the people counting on him, Vivek began to weep, and his own tears weakened the ash casing enough that he broke free, then went on to shatter the casts holding his people and breathe life back into them himself, curing the blight that had taken hold of their bodies in the process. A living God, brought to tears by his own helplessness, ended up saving his people by crying, not by any of the more obvious shows of divine power he was famous for using every single day. His other displays of power leaned more toward the spectacular. When a second wave of invaders from Akavir, a force of snow demons called the Camel, pressed into Morrowind after sacking a Nordic city, Vivek's answer was to teach the assembled Dunmer soldiers how to breathe underwater for a single day, then flood the very battlefield where the fighting was happening, drowning the invading army where it stood. He is credited with turning back 2 separate Akaviri invasions, this way across his long life, once by flanking an army with the help of an old enemy, the Drog, and once by simply making the ground itself swallow the enemy in water. Even the reason his own people turned grey-skinned and red-eyed after the curse that made them Dunmer has more than one telling behind it. Alongside the more common account of a Daedric prince's punishment, Vivek's own sermons claim the goddess Boethia simply asked the Chimer to take on the color of a bruise, and that it was Vivek's own grief and brooding that turned his people's skin into what the text calls pregnant darkness. 2 different explanations exist side by side for the same change in an entire people's skin color, and Vivek's own writing is the source of at least one of them. Even the ordinary trappings of his rule carried the same split personality running through everything else about him. Each member of the tribunal had a city named for them, and each of those cities carried a second name apart from the god who lived there, so that Vivek's own city was also called Vivek City, distinct from the man himself even while sharing his name. Each tribune also had an honor guard built in their own image, Vivek's being a knightly order called the Buoyant Armigers, and each was tied to a particular time of day, Sothasil to the morning, Almalexia to the middle of the day, and Vivek to what the old texts call his star-spun night. A god defined by being 2 things at once ended up ruling under the sign of night instead of day, watched over by armigers instead of priests, in a city that was never quite only his. Even his disappearance carries the same uncertainty that runs through the rest of his story. When the Daedric hordes of Mehrunes Dagon poured into the world during the Oblivion Crisis, both Vivek and the reincarnated Nerevar had already gone missing, and Vardenfell's own capital city fought off the invasion without either of its 2 greatest protectors anywhere to be found. The defenders of that city even revived a giant ancient emperor crab named Scar in a desperate attempt to hold the line, and it fell along with everything else. Prayers sent up to Vivek and to Nerevar during the siege simply went unanswered, and nobody has ever explained where either of them actually was while their own capital burned. The next being on this list isn't a god at all, it is an ape. The Imga are a race of great apes native to Valenwood, and the research is blunt about their timeline. They flourished in those forests long before the Aldmer, the High Elves, ever showed up. They are old. Older than elves in that part of the world. And then, once the Aldmer did arrive, the Imga spent a large part of their following history imitating them. Some Imga came to see the Altmer as a kind of ideal, a picture of what a civilized society looked like, and they went to real lengths to copy it. They wear capes, they practice with dueling swords, they try to speak with perfect courtly manners despite having gravelly, deep voices that don't really suit that kind of speech. Some of the more extreme ones shave their bodies and powder their skin white to look more like the elves they are copying. They hold perfumed cloth to their noses around men because they consider men beneath them, lesser beast folk, even while pretending at elven refinement themselves. It is a strange kind of history for a race to have. Get to a place first, then spend generations dressing up as the people who turned up second. Even their own bodies have been used against them by outsiders who never bother to see the imitation as anything sympathetic. Fine hand warmers made from Imga fur have turned up in trade, their stitched labels boasting that the fur inside came from treacherous Imga, as though the animal being killed for its pelt were also somehow guilty of something. Away from the elf imitation, the Imga have their own quieter culture too. They enjoy music and beat out rhythms on hollow logs used as drums. Every year, colonies of Imga climb the tall grat oaks of Valenwood to gather an arboreal rodent called the calliope, jumping and swinging beneath the branches with the same natural agility that makes them such good climbers, and the calliope they catch gets turned into a simple peasant dish named after the harvest itself. There is even a drink named for them, sold under the name Sipping Imga Tonic. None of that culture stopped some Imga from also shaving their bodies white and powdering their skin to look more like the elves living around them, which is the odd contradiction sitting right at the center of who the Imga are. A people with real traditions of their own, who nonetheless spent a great deal of effort trying to look like someone else entirely. That would already be an odd entry on its own, but the reason the Imga belong on this list is one specific ape. His name was Maruch, and he lived in the First Era, and he is, without exaggeration, one of the most consequential religious figures in the history of Tamriel. The story goes that Maruch served what is called a century of penance, a long stretch of punishment atop a place called the Stone Meadows, after some trouble involving an ape maiden named Dulsa. While he was up there, he received a vision of Saint Alessia, the founder of the First Seyrodilic Empire, who was dead by that point. The vision compelled him to write down what he heard, and he wrote it in his own blood, in a text known as the Alessian Doctrines, sometimes called the 77 Inflexible Doctrines. Out of that text came the Alessian Order, a theocracy that didn't stay a small cult. It grew into one of the largest and most powerful religious movements Tamriel has ever seen, controlling an empire, shaping law, and reworking how much of the continent understood its own gods. It's worth stating plainly, an ape started one of the biggest religions in the history of this world. Maruch's teachings left fingerprints all over Tamrielic law and belief that are still around today. His doctrine held that all are guilty until they have proven themselves innocent, and that line became a real foundation of the Tamrielic legal system, followed long after the order itself was gone. His preaching pushed toward the idea of a single, unknowable God instead of the old scattered pantheons, and that shift helped shape what would eventually become the modern worship of the 8 divines. The order was strict almost to the point of cruelty. People who lived under it remembered it as a dark age, austere and joyless, and its hatred of elves, especially the Aelids, was a central feature rather than a side note. The order sacked Aelid holy sites, burned Aelid writings, and treated resistance to the emperor as resistance to the gods themselves. The order's push even reached back into Valenwood, the Imga's own home. One of Maruch's strongest supporters, the Nordic High King Borgas, traveled there hoping to rally a joint war against the Bosmer, and instead fell victim to the Wild Hunt, a fate that ended up dissolving the order's reform in Valenwood before it ever really took root there. Inside the order was an even more devoted inner circle called the Marukati Selective, and some accounts say this group included sorcerer apes of their own, called Magi apes. The Selective's obsession with purity ran so deep that they reportedly tried to strip anything elven out of the god Akatosh himself, in an attempt to make him purely human in nature. Whether that attempt actually worked or backfired into an enormous stretch of broken, non-linear time remembered as the Middle Dawn is disputed even inside the lore itself, with sources contradicting each other about what happened and how long it lasted. Some scholars dismiss the whole idea as an error. Other evidence undercuts that dismissal in an odd way, since the very book making that argument turns up displaced in time itself, which is the kind of detail that keeps this particular argument from ever settling. The ritual the Selective is said to have performed to strip Akatosh of his elven nature is described almost like a fever dream, more than a spell. A staff, or a tower, or perhaps both at once, is said to have appeared before the sect's secret masters, who danced upon it until it writhed and trembled, and finally spoke its own true, hidden name aloud. The tower then split into 8 pieces, and time itself broke apart, becoming non-linear for what is estimated at 1008 years before the pieces of that tower finally came to rest and the strange period ended. Every culture on Tamriel remembers that stretch of broken time in its own way, mostly as a period of unexplained spiritual anguish, and the surviving accounts of it contradict each other about which wars happened, which gods walked the earth, and even what color the sun was during it. The only detail every single culture agrees on, no matter how differently they remember the rest of it, is that 8 stars fell from the sky, one by one, while it was happening. None of that changes the plain shape of the story though. A great ape, native to a stretch of forest that elves moved into after his people were already there, had a vision of a dead human queen, wrote her words down in his own blood, and out of that came one of the largest religions Tamriel has ever known. The order didn't fade quickly either. It held power for close to 2,000 years by some counts, though even that timeline is argued over by scholars who can't agree on how long the Alessian order actually lasted. At its height, the archprelate who led the order held influence that was said to be nearly equal to the emperor's own. It finally came apart in a 10-year conflict called the War of Righteousness, which ended in the year 2321 of the First Era, and even after that collapse, the order refused to disappear completely. Its ideas kept surfacing for generations afterward under different names, including a later movement called the Temple Zero Society, which kept preaching its own version of what it called the Monkey Truth. Maruk himself is still remembered today in small, ordinary ways that have outlived the empire his visions built. To this day, some Bretons mark a solemn holiday called Maruk's Day every year, in honor of the ape whose century of punishment on a mountaintop turned into a religion that reshaped a continent. The Imga themselves never became rulers off the back of any of this. Long after Maruk's death, most of his own people were still living in Valenwood's forests, still imitating the Altmer, still treated in places as slaves, not as the descendants of a prophet who had changed the world. That gap between Maruk's outsized legacy and his own people's ordinary, often difficult lives is its own strange footnote to the story. Centuries later, during the Three Banners War, nearly the entire Imga population vanished from Valenwood at once, apparently as part of an old, time-tested strategy of hiding out somewhere safe whenever real warfare broke out and simply waiting for it to end. Nobody recorded exactly where they went, and one controversial scholar's guess that they had gone to visit a wandering, vanished city called Valinesti to wait things out was rejected by most of her peers as speculation. During roughly that same stretch of missing years, an Imga Lich queen was said to be ruling a settlement in Elsewhere before a well-known agent named Razumdar tracked her down and put an end to her reign. Whether that Lich Queen had any connection to the vanished Imga of Valenwood is never explained. The Imga themselves simply turned back up again a few decades later, with no account anywhere of where they had actually been. Even the Imga's own existence hasn't gone entirely unchallenged. One writer, an author named Uruld, with no particular authority on the subject, argued in a text called An Argument for Common Sense that the Imga weren't a real species at all, just an unflattering caricature invented to mock the Bosmer who shared their forests. Uruld's argument gets little credit from other scholars, partly because he seems to have argued the same thing about nearly every beastfolk race he hadn't personally seen with his own eyes. Still, it is a strange kind of footnote for history to attach to a species whose most famous member is credited with founding one of the largest religions Tamriel has ever known. At least one writer has gone on record insisting the whole species was never real to begin with. The next one is a much smaller story, and the record on it is thin, so it doesn't need to be stretched out. The Orma were a tribe of men native to Black Marsh, living alongside the Horwali, the Kotringi, and the Yespest. Nobody actually knows how they got there. The sources offer three guesses, and don't pick one. Maybe they were sent as refugees, maybe as prisoners, or maybe they just settled the coastal waterways on their own and adapted to the swamp over time. That is disputed, and it stays disputed. What makes the Orma worth including here is simple and physical. They were born without eyes. Ordinary blindness still leaves the eyes in place, just unable to see. The Orma skulls didn't have eye sockets at all. In place of sight, they became masters of touch and their other senses. They lived through the first and second eras in that swamp, and by the late third era, they were no longer considered to live there at all, which is its own quiet mystery, since nothing in the record explains where they went. The clearest physical trace they left behind is almost eerie on its own. According to bone scroll canisters, one Orma skull, with its telltale missing sockets, was used as a door marker for a room holding powerful artifacts in a place called Skurg Barrow, a whole people who never had eyes, and the strongest evidence they existed is a skull nailed up to mark a door. Next comes a being who isn't human, elf, or beast in any simple sense, and who spends most of his existence pretending to be someone's pet. Barbas is the hound of the Daedric prince Clavicus Vile. He is a shapeshifter, and he can take other forms, but the shape he wears almost all the time is a dog. That alone would make him a minor oddity among the Daedra, the kind of loyal familiar that shows up around a lot of gods in a lot of myths. But Barbas isn't a familiar. He is described as a repository for around half of Clavicus Vile's own power that isn't a figure of speech. Vile keeps roughly half of himself inside the dog all the time, as a matter of ordinary arrangement between them. And despite being, in some sense, half of his own master, Barbas doesn't act like an obedient piece of Vile. He often warns people against Vile's own plots. He tips off mortals before they walk into one of Vile's bargains. That behavior only makes sense if Barbas has some real measure of free will, discretion of his own, which isn't something a god usually builds into half of himself on purpose. Whether Barbas and Vile are truly two separate beings, or one being that has simply split itself in two because Vile's nature demands a companion, is genuinely disputed in the lore, and no source settles it either way. Vile has been asked directly why Barbas stays a dog, and his answer is worth hearing in his own words. He likes being a dog. When he's like this, I think he's somewhere else. It's all quite significant, of course, but who knows what it means? That is a god talking about half of his own power as though it were a separate person with private thoughts he can't fully access. Vile has, at points, grown tired of Barbas and simply abandoned him, leaving him to wander as a stray. This isn't a new arrangement either. Cave paintings and idols dating back to the Merethic era already show Clavicus Vile standing beside a large hound long before any of the events that give Barbas his name and his history in the written record. Whatever Barbas actually is, he has been standing next to Vile for as long as anyone has been drawing pictures of Vile at all. Vile's own name carries a strange claim behind it. The slowed sorcerer Nagasta, the same necromancer who would later go on to serve the King of Worms, once claimed that Clavicus Vile was born before the stars existed, and that his very name came first. Older than the ideas the name now stands for. Vile collects titles the way Molag Bal does. The consummate politician of oblivion, the master of insidious wishes, and the child god of the morning star, on top of the more common Prince of Trickery and Bargains. Even his more ordinary nickname has a strange history behind it. Some call him Nikot, a name a mortal cult made up by mistake, misreading 5 letters of his actual Daedric name as if they were ordinary Tamrielic script. Cyrodiil's own vampire nobility count Vile as one of their 2 patrons alongside Molag Bal, whom they call Kin Father, crediting the 2 princes together for giving vampires enough reason and social standing to live openly among ordinary mortals instead of hiding in the dark. Vile's bargains don't always look like bargains at the time they are made. In the 6th century of the First Era, in the middle of the Knahaten Flu, one dying tribe of Kothringi in Black Marsh begged any Daedra who would listen for help, and Vile answered, offering to save them from the flu at the cost of their mortality. They agreed, and lived on as a kind of undead that couldn't die of it, all the way into the Second Era, when the truth of what had happened to them finally came out. At that point, whoever looked into the matter faced an ugly choice with no clean answer: break the old curse and kill off the last of the tribe outright, including the ones who still wanted to keep living, or leave the rest of them trapped in that unwilling half-life forever. Which choice actually got made isn't recorded anywhere. Vile got what he wanted either way, a bargain that kept mattering centuries after he made it. However, it finally ended. Barbas often turns up wearing a disguise rather than his own dog shape. In the Second Era, he spent time posing as a scamp merchant named Creeper, running a general store beneath the city of Mournhold after its previous owner turned up mysteriously dead. Around the same time, he impersonated an archcanon of the Tribunal Temple named Tarvus, using that disguise to help Clavicus Vile hunt for the location of the Clockwork City, a plot that nearly caused the moon-sized rock to crash into a holy city before it was stopped. He has warned mortals away from his master's bargains more than once since, including talking a hero out of delivering a cursed sword that would have devastated Vile's own realm, an act of loyalty to the deal's other side rather than to Vile himself. By the early Fourth Era, Vile had grown tired enough of him that he simply abandoned Barbas outright, leaving him wandering as a stray dog in a forest in Skyrim, cut off from his own master's power until a passing traveler eventually helped patch the relationship back together. Even that reconciliation came with a choice attached. Whoever helped them could have kept an artifact and let Barbas be banished for centuries, or handed everything back and let Master and Hound return to each other. Either way, Clavicus Vile always ends up reunited with the half of himself that walks around on four legs. His clearest act of independence came during a crisis on the floating island of Umbriel, when two mortals tried to bargain with Vile for help, and the negotiation was falling apart. It was Barbas, not Vile, who stepped in and gave the mortals a second chance to make their case, and that single interruption from the god's own hound ended up being the reason the negotiation succeeded at all. Even the mad god Sheogorath is said to dislike Barbas enough to have plans, however serious or unserious, to kill him with hemlock, which is either a small joke between two very old powers or a real grudge with no explained cause. Either way, it says something that the one being Barbas keeps siding against, again and again, is the very god who keeps half of his own power locked inside him. Barbas has even ended up bound against his own will by mortal accident rather than by Vile's design. A clumsy novice mage once cast a spell hoping only that it would work well, not realizing an old, forgotten altar to Clavicus Vile sat nearby, and the wish that God granted bound Barbas to that altar without either Vile or Barbas having any say in the matter. A traveler eventually found the altar, smashed it, and freed him. A being who is supposedly half of a god's own power turned out to be just as capable of getting trapped by a stranger's careless wish as any ordinary mortal would have been. Those four are strange on their own terms. A two-toned god, a religion-founding ape, an eyeless tribe, half a Daedric prince wearing a dog's body. The beings that come next are stranger in a different way. With them, it starts to get hard to say the word being without adding a footnote. Take the Magna Ge. During the Dawn Era, when the gods were still in the middle of building the mortal world, Mundus, the god Magnus, was the one drawing up its schematics. He was the architect, but partway through the work, Magnus decided he had seen enough. Building the world was costing the gods pieces of themselves, and Magnus chose to quit and flee back to Aetherius rather than keep paying that price. He wasn't alone in leaving. A whole family of divine beings, his own kin, went with him. As they tore their way out of Mundus and back toward Aetherius, they ripped holes in the veil of oblivion behind them, and it is through those very holes that the light of Aetherius reaches down into Mundus at all. Those holes are the stars. The Magna Ge are now identified directly with the stars themselves, because the stars are what they made on their way out the door. Magnus never took a mate. He forged his own children out of Aether, his daughters said to have emerged straight from forges, and those daughters are most of what the Magna Ge actually are. One of those daughters did something none of her sisters did. Her name was Meridnunda, and instead of following the rest of the family back out to Aetherius, she went the other way, into the void. The Daedric princes, who already lived out there, noticed the newcomer and weren't pleased about it. They chided her for trespassing on their territory. Rather than leave, Meridnunda carved out a realm of her own inside that space and stayed. She is now known as the Daedric Prince Meridia. Put plainly, one of the stars in Tamriel's sky defected. She stopped being a hole in the veil that let light through and became a Daedric prince with a realm and followers of her own, and she has been that ever since. Meridnunda wasn't traveling alone when the Magna Ge first left. She had sisters, among them Nemoli, sometimes called the Blue Star, said to be visible even in the daytime sky during a dragon break, and Zirolig, along with several others who together made up a group known as the Nine Coruscations, a name the Aelids themselves used for them. Some accounts go further still and credit the Magna Ge with an even darker legacy, claiming they were the ones who created the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon, meant as a tool to unmake the flawed world Magnus had already abandoned. That claim is credited to the heretic Munkar Camoran and to a monastery's forbidden texts, not to any settled record, and it should be read with that in mind. But if there is anything to it, then the same family whose exit wounds let light into this world may also have built the being most associated with tearing that world back down. One of Meridnunda's own sisters ended up with a stranger fate than becoming a Daedric prince. The eldest of the nine, called the Prime Archon, is now identified as Itelia, a Daedric prince mentioned further down this list, the same one Hermaeus Mora and a circle of other princes eventually hunted down, sealed away, and erased from the memory of everyone in existence. Meridnunda escaped her family by choosing the void on her own terms. Her own oldest sister got erased from reality altogether for growing too dangerous. Meridnunda's own break from her family is remembered differently depending on who is telling the story. Khajiit myth describes her as cast out of Aetherius for consorting with illicit spectra, and one old telling has her joining an assault meant to break through a barrier protecting the moons, only to be fought to a standstill, split herself into two in a failed escape attempt, and finally get bound inside the void with mirrors by the goddess Azura. Other tellings say that binding never actually held for good, and that Meridnunda has escaped it more than once since. As Meridia, she kept a version of that old power over time even after becoming a Daedric prince, said to be able to bend the rate at which time itself moves forward, and remembered as glowing brightest in the sky during a dragon break, when time is already breaking down everywhere else at once. A star that defected didn't just start a new life on the other side. She kept the one power that made her family what they were in the first place, and turned it into a weapon. Magnus himself didn't simply vanish once he reached Aetherius. Different races still tell their own version of why he left and what it cost him. To the Khajiit, he is Magrus, and one old story says that when he tried to flee from the gods Bothra and Lorkhaj, he could only see out of one eye and fell into the space between worlds, where the goddess Azura judged him too fearful to be trusted with a share of creation and tore out his remaining eye before letting him go. Other tellings insist he gave up that eye willingly, as an offering rather than a punishment. Bosmer storytellers describe the sun and every star the same way this account already has, as holes torn in the wall of night by Magnus and the spirits who fled with him, still trying to get out. A god who quit partway through building the world left behind so many different explanations for why that entire race built separate religions just around arguing over his reasons. Some of his followers took his abandonment of Nirn as a kind of promise, not a betrayal. A peaceful order called the Priory of the Golden Staff, headquartered in High Rock, believed Magnus watches the world from inside the sun itself, waiting for the right moment to come back and repair what the rest of the gods got wrong when they finished the job without him. They kept forbidden texts describing the Magnage's own search for a tool that could unmake Nirn's flaws and set it right again, the same search that some accounts tie back to the creation of Myrun's Dagon. Magnus himself picked up a title for his absence that says everything plainly: He who abstained, a god remembered less for anything he built than for the moment he decided to stop. Imperial religion doesn't even count him as a full divine, on the grounds that he gave the world magic without ever giving it his whole self, and calls the gift a mixed one, doing about as much harm in the world as good. Even his own staff seems built around the same idea of quitting before things go too far. Legend says the staff of Magnus is the only object that can safely hold his full power, and that it will abandon whichever mage is wielding it. The moment that mage grows strong enough to upset the balance, the staff is sworn to protect. A god who walked out on his own creation rather than pay its full price left behind a weapon that walks out on its own wielders for exactly the same reason. Take the Slode. They are semi-aquatic, heavy-set slug people from the coral kingdoms of Thraz, and there doesn't seem to be any real limit on how large they can grow or how long they can live. Their whole culture runs on necromancy. A Khajiit explorer named Jadasha ranked them alongside krakens and sea serpents as among the worst and most dangerous things living in the sea. And that isn't an exaggeration coming from someone who had presumably seen a lot of the sea's other horrors. In the year 2200 of the First Era, the Slode engineered and released the Thracian Plague on Tamriel. It killed roughly half the population of the continent. That single fact says enough about the plague on its own. This isn't the place to walk through how the disease spread or how it was eventually stopped. What matters for the Slode themselves is what they did once the plague had done its work. They didn't just unleash a weapon and retreat. They sailed in afterward, while the coastal cities were gutted and weak, and sacked them, taking captives to enslave. The plague wasn't the whole plan. It was the opening move of a raid. The plague's aftermath reshaped Tamriel almost as much as the plague itself did. Pulling together a fleet big enough to finally answer it meant old rivals across western Tamriel setting aside their feuds long enough to build the All Flags Navy together, and that unlikely alliance shifted the balance of power in the Iliac Bay for generations afterward, a shift some scholars credit as one of the causes behind the War of Righteousness, the same 10-year war that finally ended the Alessian order mentioned earlier on this list. The Khajiit felt it too. The plague's death toll broke apart what had been 16 peaceful, coexisting Khajiiti states, splitting them for good into the two rival regions still known today as Palatine and Anekina. Even Valenwood, the Imga's own home from earlier on this list, felt the ripple. Generations later, the province still hadn't fully recovered its old strength, and that lingering weakness is part of why Valenwood eventually fell under imperial control at all. The Slode themselves are as strange up close as the plague makes them seem from a distance. They are said to feel little in the way of ordinary emotion, though they can act it out convincingly enough when dealing with more emotional races, and they honor laws, loyalties, and friendships only for as long as doing so serves their own calculations. Nothing about blasphemy, theft, kidnapping, murder, or wiping out an entire people troubles their conscience if it helps them reach a goal. Their own language doesn't even have a word for adventure. The closest equivalent translates more accurately as tragic disaster, and in their own stories, the villains are always the ones who act quickly or rashly, while the heroes are the patient ones who plan for years before doing anything at all. Physically, there doesn't seem to be a ceiling on how big or how old an adult Sloth can get. Young Sloths start out as small amorphous grubs and are cared for so little that their own parents will kill them to render into Sloth soap, an ingredient used in necromantic ritual. Even their pets tell the same story. The Sloth bred bright orange dragon frogs so they could be spotted more easily in their own murky lagoons, and the Sloth word for the frogs doesn't actually mean pet. It translates as snacks. Sacrifice was part of their culture too, in a form nobody outside Thras claims to fully understand. Some Sloth were dropped from the top of a great tower called the Pillar of Thras, and while most simply fell to their deaths, some vanished into oblivion before they hit the ground. Not even the Sloth themselves are said to know why only some of them were taken. Whatever the Sloth actually are underneath all of that, they built an entire war fleet's worth of enemies just by existing, and the largest combined naval force Tamriel had ever assembled was needed to finally sink their coral kingdoms beneath the waves. Even assembling that fleet came at a cost. Shipyards building the warships had to fend off a sea beast called the Molmor first, described as something between a massive whale and an octopus bristling with spines longer than a knight's lance, and it took a clever trick, not brute force, to finally turn the thing to stone. The Sloth used their own strange transport as well, riding living gas bags called Sloth floaters through the air to move both goods and soldiers, a detail that fits a people who, on land, are usually too heavy and slow-moving to bother walking anywhere at all. Not every Sloth lives in the coral kingdoms of Thras, either. A more reclusive branch, called Sea Sloth, rules its own separate undersea realms out in the Sea of Pearls, skilled in alchemy, shadow magic, and mind magic on top of the necromancy their Thracian cousins are known for, and served by crustacean creatures they command through a mix of language and mental compulsion. Whatever the Sloth actually left behind of their old empire, some of it survives as objects rather than people. A pair of armored gloves called the Thracian Stranglers, built from scavenged elven shipwreck metal, coral, and leather that may or may not have been peeled from the Sloth's own young, still turn up in Tamriel today, granting whoever wears them power that grows the longer they are worn, at the cost of the wearer's own endurance. One captured account, taken from a defeated fleet's own records, describes an audience with what it calls an elder distended one, inside a submerged tower. A Sloth leader so enormous and so old that its body had grown 3 separate eyes across its own belly, each one reopening as a toothless mouth that disgorged objects for waiting attendants to eagerly eat. Whether that description is meant literally or is simply how a terrified sailor chose to describe whatever leadership structure the Sloth actually use among themselves isn't something any source resolves. It is left exactly as strange as it sounds. The Sloth never fully went away after their coral kingdoms were sunk, either. Centuries later, imperial authorities were still actively encouraging ordinary citizens to report any sighting of a living Sloth anywhere in Tamriel, treating the mere presence of one as a matter worth the crown's attention. A famous Second-era Sloth necromancer named Nagasta went on to serve the undead sorcerer known as the King of Worms, one of the most feared figures in all of Tamriel, which says plainly enough what kind of company a Sloth keeps even after its own empire is gone. Take Tosh Raka, though the record on him is short, so this one stays short too. He's the emperor of Kapotun, the Tiger Dragon Empire of Akavir, and at some point, through methods no source actually explains, he turned himself into a real dragon. The process is said to have made him a god in the process. He may be the largest dragon alive anywhere, described as a 100-foot tall tiger fitted with bat-like wings. One source goes further and suggests he might be an Akaviri avatar of Akatosh himself, holding a grudge against what that source calls his mirror brother. That is one source's suggestion, not a settled fact, and it should be read as exactly that. His name backs up the theory a little, at least as wordplay. Both Aka and Tosh can mean dragon, and depending on how it is used, Tosh can also mean tiger or time, which lines up neatly with a dragon being a creature tied to time itself. Tosh Raka has been planning, since at least the Second Era, to conquer the rest of Akavir. If he manages that, Tamriel is next on the list. Everything up through Tosh Raka was strange because of what these beings were born as. The ones that come next are strange because of what they chose to become. And the last one covered here, near the end of this list, didn't choose any of it. Everything that happened to him was done to him by people he had once called friends, gods included. Start that next stretch with the Underking. The Underking is a figure out of Third Era myth, remembered as the old bugbear of fairy tales, the kind of story parents told to explain the shape of the world without quite explaining it. Some tales call him an ancient lich. Others call him the most powerful mage who ever lived. The stories agree on one strange detail, no matter which version gets told. At some point his heart disappeared, and without it he couldn't truly live and couldn't truly die either. He existed in the gap between those two states for centuries. Who the Underking actually was is a real unresolved dispute, and the lore just doesn't settle it. Most sources, including the Underking's own testimony, say he was once Zurin Arctus, the battle mage who served Emperor Tiber Septim. Arctus helped build the Mantella, a giant soul gem meant to power the Numidium, a colossal brass construct, and he used his own life force, his own heart, to do it. When Tiber Septim later turned that same weapon against the neutral royal families of Tamriel instead of just its intended enemies, Arctus tried to take his heart back. In the fight that followed, he was killed, and his heart was blasted loose into the netherworld of Aetherius. Cut off from it, he couldn't die properly. He became the undead figure known as the Underking, sending his agents out across Tamriel for years afterward, searching for a way to reclaim what he had lost. But a text called the Arcturian Heresy tells an entirely different story, and it names a different man. Ysmir Wulfart, the old High King of Skyrim, a being who had already died and come back to life more than once by that point in his own legend. In this version, it was Wulfarth's heart trapped in the Mantella, not Arctus's, and Arctus himself was simply the one killed while helping to trap it. The two accounts don't agree on who the Underking actually was, and the lore simply doesn't resolve it. It isn't a puzzle with a hidden answer waiting to be found. It is a straightforward disagreement between sources, including a disagreement with the Underking's own claims about himself, and nobody, including the character at the center of the mystery, has ever settled which version is true. The Wulfhearth version of events fills in a part of the story that Zurin Arctus's own account leaves out entirely, how the Underking ended up standing next to Tiber Septim in the first place. Nearing the end of the interregnum, the greybeards of High Hrothgar woke Wulfhearth to speak of a prophecy, a coming emperor who would beat back the elves and unite Tamriel under one crown. Wulfhearth wanted badly for that prophecy to be about himself, so he traveled to High Hrothgar to find out. He wasn't the one. The greybeards' own voices blasted him back into ash right there on the mountain, and as the ashes scattered, they warned him to watch for a betrayal still coming. The actual man in the prophecy turned out to be a young soldier named Hjalti Earlybeard, fighting for a minor king in the Colovian estates. Wulfhearth found him in the middle of a night battle at Old Hroldan, appeared to him as a living storm, and sheltered his troops from arrow fire long enough for Hjalti to shout down the enemy's own walls and take the town. That single night carried Hjalti all the way to an empire. He took the name Tiber Septim, and Wulfhearth stayed close to him from then on, The same closeness that would end, years later, in a betrayal exactly like the one the Greybeards had warned him about. By the time of the war in the West, decades after his supposed death, the Underking was still active enough to bid on his own old possessions. When the artifact known as the Totem of Tiber Septim resurfaced and sparked a bidding war among 7 rival powers, the Underking made his own case for it directly, in words that have survived. Centuries ago, Tiber Septim ruled the land and forged an empire with great Numidium. The secret of Numidium's power lies in its heart, carried within the Mantella. It is the heart of Tiber Septim's battle mage. It is my heart. It is my Mantella, it is my totem. It belongs to me and to none other. Whoever was speaking those words, Zurin Arctus or Ysmir Wulfharth, was arguing that a weapon built to conquer a continent was, at bottom, just a piece of himself that had gotten lost. The Underking finally got what he actually wanted out of that whole exchange. It was never really the totem itself. It was one last chance to be whole again, however briefly, before dying the death he had been denied for centuries. In the years between his supposed death and that final reunion with his own heart, the Underking kept turning up as a kind of unkillable nuisance to the very empire he had helped build. He is said to have cursed 4 of Tiber Septim's own elite blades into permanent undeath at Sancre Tor, sealing them into the ruins as sentries out of pure vengeance. Later, when Tiber Septim's grandson Pelagius I took the throne, the Underking appeared again, claiming to have been sent by the old emperor himself to help guide the new one, and stayed at Pelagius' side through a run of years remembered afterward as a golden age. A being who couldn't fully live and couldn't fully die spent his long, unfinished existence circling the same empire, sometimes helping it, sometimes cursing pieces of it, always waiting for the one piece of himself that would let him finally stop. One theory tries to explain the whole Zurin Arctus versus Wulfharth dispute by suggesting the 2 men were never fully separate to begin with. It describes something called an enantiomorph, a state in which 2 individuals become part of one merged, doubled soul because of some shared catalyst, so that the 2 of them become, at least for a while, metaphysically interchangeable, with only one side ultimately winning out and keeping the memory and the name. If that theory holds, the argument over whether the Underking was Arctus or Wulfharth may be less a dispute about which man survived and more a dispute about which half of one shared. Split Soul ended up doing the remembering. That is still only a theory, offered by scholars trying to make the contradiction make sense, not a resolution the lore itself ever confirms. The Underking's final act shows the same kind of temporal strangeness that follows Numidium everywhere it goes. Once the totem changed hands and an agent of the Blades recovered the lost Mantella from a hidden plane of Aetherius, 7 separate rival powers around the Iliac Bay somehow all ended up holding the totem at once through what the sources can only call some sort of time distortion, and each of them activated a version of Numidium for their own purposes at the same moment. The Underking reclaimed his heart in the middle of that same tangled event, rejoined with the Mantella in a massive explosion, and for one brief moment was flesh and blood again before finally achieving the ordinary death he had been chasing for centuries. He got his ending in the same breath that an entire region's borders were being redrawn by 7 simultaneous, contradictory versions of the same unstoppable machine. Whichever of the 2 men actually became the Underking, Wulfharth's own life story, on its own, already reads like something built to survive death repeatedly. Legend says an enemy god once turned him and his entire kingdom back into children, and that curing his people of that curse aged Wulfharth so far past his own years that it killed him outright, the first of what would be several deaths credited to the same man. He is said to have swallowed an entire thundercloud whole, repaired a mountain stairway that a dragon had destroyed, and defeated an army of orcs using nothing but the sound of his own voice. A man capable of any one of those feats would already be a strange enough figure for a list like this one, whether or not he ever became the Underking at all. Long before he was ever High King, young Wulfharth fought on the other side of an old war, standing with the Nordic Empire against an alliance of Kymr and Dwemer known as the First Council. He tore through Chimeri villages and Dwemeri strongholds with abilities nobody else could match, until the Kymr war leader Nerevar finally beat him back by grabbing his shouting throat with his bare hands and holding on until it bled. The captured shout was handed over to a young Vivek, who bound it into a listening frame made of ebony and had it fastened onto Wulfharth's own head. Wearing it drove him mad. That single humiliation is given, in the old accounts, as the real root of the hatred Wulfharth carried for the rest of his many lives toward Vivek, Almalexia, and Sota Sil together, the same three beings who would later rule Morrowind as living gods. One old text called 5 Songs of King Wulfhart records something he is supposed to have said to his own reluctant Nordic troops right before the Battle of Red Mountain, the same battle that made the Dwemer vanish and gave the world Numidium in the first place. Don't you see where you really are? Don't you know who Shor really is? Don't you know what this war is? Some later readers take that as Wulfharth telling his own men, in plain words, that they were standing inside a broken stretch of time while it was still happening, centuries before anyone had a name for what that kind of broken time even was. Even during the long stretch when the Underking was mostly absent, hidden away rebuilding his strength in some hidden vault, his name kept showing up attached to strange happenings across Tamriel. A necromancer in Hammerfell, rumored to serve him, kept a hidden document that a wandering champion was sent to retrieve. A cursed ring, said to have been hidden away by the Underking himself, turned up in a crypt with only a single map, buried somewhere in Black Marsh, as any clue to where it had gone. His agents were described as fanatical, half insane, drawn from vampires, liches, ghosts, and ordinary rogues alike, following orders from a master whose own goals none of them were ever told. A being that couldn't properly live or die still managed to keep an entire network of followers pointed at goals only he understood, for centuries, without ever having to explain himself to any of them. The Hist come next, and they raise a different kind of question, whether a tree can be a person, and if a whole forest of them can be one single person at once. The Hist are giant, sentient spore trees, growing deep in the swamps of Black Marsh. The Argonians who live among them call themselves People of the Root, and that isn't just a poetic name. Every history is connected to every other history at the root. They are, in real practical terms, of one mind, all of them, spread across the whole swamp. Argonians claim the Hist were the very first life forms on Tamriel, older than any of the races of Menormer. Most outside scholars give that honor to the Aldmer instead, crediting the elves as the first technologically advanced people on Nirn, but even that is disputed, and some of those same scholars admit the title might actually belong to the Hist. During the ancient war among the Elnofey, the spirits who fought over the shape of the world, the Hist were mostly bystanders. That didn't save them. Most of their original realm was destroyed anyway, just from the war passing over it, whether they had a stake in the fighting or not. The Argonian calendar itself is built around the Hist's own life cycle. Young saplings, mature trees, and elder trees each have their own name in the Argonian language, and those same 3 names double as the names of months in the Argonian calendar, so that time itself, for the Argonians, is measured out in the stages a Hist tree passes through as it grows. The bond between the Hist and the Argonians runs deeper than belief. Argonian eggs are incubated in pools of Hist sap, and the Hist are part of the hatching process itself. If that connection to the eggs is ever broken, the unborn inside them die. It isn't a spiritual loss. It is a physical one, and Argonians who happen to hatch outside Black Marsh can't hear the Hist at all, cut off from that shared mind for their entire lives simply because of where they were born. But for something described as one collective mind, individual histories can go strange in their own right, developing histories that belong to them alone rather than to the shared mind of the whole swamp. One tree, called the Dreaming Tree, sacrificed its own connection to the wider Hist in order to save an entire tribe's worth of Argonian souls from invading Aelid slavers, trapping those souls safely inside an amber artifact and then falling into a centuries-long sleep once its tribe had been all but wiped out anyway. That sleep didn't last forever. Long after everyone who remembered where the amber artifact was hidden had died, a woman who had spent her whole life cut off from the Hist finally tracked it down herself, only to be swallowed whole by one of Black Marsh's own tree-like guardian creatures the moment she claimed she could hear the Hist speaking to her at last. It still took someone else giving up their own life inside the artifact to finally lead the trapped souls back out and wake the Dreaming Tree for good. Another Hist, at a village called Haj Uxith, struck its own private bargain with the Daedric prince Molag Bal to keep its tribe alive, only to be slowly poisoned by the very crystal Baal used to sustain it, suffering for years while unable to properly commune with its own people. A third, called Tsonuk Suhil, went the opposite direction entirely, growing obsessed with a version of Argonian life that the rest of Blackmarsh had already left behind, and used its own tree minder to try to force an entire city to live by rules everyone else considered outdated and unnecessary. That tree minder looked at ordinary Argonian building materials, things as plain as reeds, mud, and wood, and called using them savage, as though her own people had fallen from something better instead of simply changing over time. Trees, in other words, don't automatically inherit the same fate or the same choices just because they share the same root system. That same capacity for going it alone reached its most dramatic point with the city tree of Lilmoth in the early 4th era. It separated itself from the shared consciousness of every other history in Blackmarsh and started acting on its own. And what that one rogue tree did next is the whole reason it belongs on this list. In the year 48 of the 4th era, the rogue Hist of Lilmoth summoned a flying city called Umbriel, split off from the Daedric prince Clavicus Vile's own realm, and pointed it at Tambriel. What Umbriel actually was, and what happened once it arrived, is its own long story for somewhere else. What matters here is just this: a single tree, cut off from the shared mind of every other tree of its kind, reached across realities and called down a floating city on the world, on its own initiative, answering to no one. The Hist have directed Argonian history before, on a smaller and less catastrophic scale, and always through the same channel. A group of Argonian leaders called the Angelil, who are said to speak for the shared will of the trees. During the Oblivion Crisis, the Hist are said to have foreseen the coming invasion, and, through the Angelil, ordered every Argonian in the Empire's service to turn and attack the Daedric gates opening across Blackmarsh. The Argonians poured into those gates with such force that Mehrunes Dagon's own lieutenants had to seal them shut, and in the aftermath, the Empire's authority in Blackmarsh simply collapsed, with the Argonians answering to the Angelil from then on instead. A tree that speaks through sap and dreams and windchimes still managed to end an empire's grip on an entire province, just by telling its people, all at once, to fight back. The sap itself isn't a gentle substance. Argonians who lick it from a Hist trunk can receive visions directly from the tree, and drinking enough of it is said to sharpen combat skill, but drinking too much of it carries real physical cost, including a permanent gold tinge to the tongue, a thickening and darkening of the scales, and hallucinations that don't always stop. Some histories leak an entirely different substance than sap, called amber plasm, and despite looking like it belongs to the tree, it isn't his sap at all. It is raw, chaotic stuff from Oblivion itself, seeping through the tree like blood from a wound that was never really the tree's own to begin with. One company of mercenaries once smuggled a history out of Black Marsh entirely to a base far outside its home swamp in order to farm its sap for profit. The tree, mistreated and cut off from the rest of its kind, produced sap that drove non-Argonians into dangerous fits of bloodlust, and eventually poisoned even the Argonians who had once safely drunk from histories their whole lives. A tree ripped away from the collective mind it belonged to didn't become harmless. It became something closer to a wound that kept spreading poison the longer it was left to suffer alone. Hermaeus Mora comes next, and he is strange in a quieter way than most of the beings on this list, because his strangeness isn't really about power, it is about what he wants. He is a Daedric prince, called among other things the Abyssal Cephaliarch and the Eye that Wanders, and his sphere is forbidden knowledge and fate. The single fact that explains him best is something close to his own words. He wants to observe all knowledge and see it become fully known. He has no interest in changing any of it. That is a strange thing for a being with his kind of power to want. Most Daedric princes in this setting want followers, or souls, or revenge, or some change made to the world in their own image. Hermaeus Mora doesn't appear to want any of that. He isn't ambitious in the way the others are. He is curious, permanently and completely, about everything that exists, and that curiosity is said to extend to anyone who happens to be learning about him at any given moment, which is an unsettling thought once it settles in. His sphere also covers destiny itself, and because of that, he reads the tides of fate by looking at the past and the future at the same time, treating them less like two separate directions and more like one continuous thing he can look at from wherever he happens to be standing. His realm, Apocrypha, is described as an endless library, full of untitled books bound in black, holding knowledge that is meant to stay forbidden. And when someone wanders too far into that library and finds themselves somewhere they shouldn't be, it is the lurkers who come up to deal with it. Towering, fish-like things with rows of needle teeth, rising out of the pools scattered through the library to spit dark, poisonous tendrils at whatever has trespassed. Hermaeus Mora rarely bothers to intervene directly. He doesn't need to. He can simply watch, take notes, and let his library's own guardians handle the rest. Even the lurkers themselves get put to use beyond guard duty. Armor sheathings can be cut straight from a living lurker and chemically treated to stay in a kind of quasi-life afterward, and nobody making that armor seems especially interested in whether the lurker being harvested had any say in the matter. That patience doesn't mean he never acts. When a rival Daedric prince named Italia grew powerful enough in his judgment to threaten the entire structure of fate itself, Hermaeus Mora helped organize an alliance of Daedric princes to hunt her down, imprison her, and then, once she was sealed away, erase the memory of her existence from every mind across all of reality. That isn't a small use of power for a being who claims his only real interest is observing, rather than changing anything. It suggests that even Hermaeus Mora, patient and curious as he is described to be, has limits on what he is willing to simply watch unfold. On a smaller and more personal scale, one dragon priest named Mirak sought Mora out for power over dragons and became his champion for a time, learning secrets that let him bend the will of even the great worms of the Merethic era, before turning on his own teacher and trying to break free of Apocrypha entirely, decades before the last Dragonborn would end up finishing what that betrayal started. Sailors have their own version of Mora, calling him the Tide King and blaming him for ships that vanish without a trace at sea, insisting that any captain who ignores an omen, curses at a storm, or carries forbidden cargo risks being the next one the Eye chooses to pull under. Some of his most devoted worshippers mark their own bodies with painted tentacles in his honor, seeking out lost books to carry back into his library in exchange for scraps of the knowledge he hoards. One of his best-known gifts is the Ohma Infinium, a tome so dense with knowledge that reading it can nearly overwhelm a mortal mind, and another is the Black Book, a class of artifacts scattered across Tamriel in the depths of old ruins. Each one bound in a cover with no title, and each one holding some single piece of forbidden knowledge meant as a private reward for whichever mortal Mora happens to be favoring at the time. He doesn't appear to hand any of it out for free. Every gift comes with a price attached, whether that price is a life, a memory, or, in at least one recorded case, a follower's own name. That price shows up plainly in the story of Miraak's old temple. When the last Dragonborn needed Hermaeus Mora's help to reach Miraak and stop him, Mora agreed, but the price he took wasn't paid by the Dragonborn at all. He took the traditions and oral history of an entire people, the Skull tribe of Solstheim, killing their shaman in the process to make sure the debt got collected, the favor got done. The bill just landed on somebody who never agreed to it. Not everyone trapped in Apocrypha is a captive in the ordinary sense. A settlement called Cypher's Midden sits at the center of the realm, home to mortal scholars Hermaeus Mora brought there himself, and now simply leaves alone, since he takes no real interest in how they govern themselves once they belong to him. Nobody there outranks anybody else. Whatever order exists, they worked out on their own, since it clearly wasn't going to come from their host. Other mortals fare worse. The hushed are what is left of people the realm's knowledge finally consumed completely, wandering the halls with no real mind left of their own, and Mora sets them to guard his most private vault. A shifting pocket space called the Infinite Panopticon, whose entrance never appears in the same place twice, holding secrets even his other servants aren't trusted to see. One Aelid city, Bisnancel, built an entire congregation of worshippers around him, and when the city's king refused to give the growing cult a greater say in how the city was run, the king was deposed within months. The Aelids there went on to turn their whole city into a shrine, and their high priest struck a bargain with Hermaeus Mora to hide the place completely from an invading empire's armies, wrapped in an illusion so complete that soldiers marching straight toward it would forget why they were marching there at all. Not everyone who tries to take from him gets away with it as cleanly. A Khajiit trickster god named Rajin once broke into Mora's underwater library chasing a single book, and when Mora sensed an intruder but couldn't actually see him, Rajin convinced the prince to bring out every single one of his countless eyes at once, just to prove there was nothing there to find. The effort of manifesting all of them simultaneously was enough to distract even Hermaeus Mora, just long enough for Rajin to grab the book and vanish. Even a being who claims to know everything can still be talked into looking the wrong way at the right moment. Scattered through Apocrypha itself are the fossilized remains of enormous sea creatures, unlike anything known to exist on Nirn, and some of his followers believe those bones are all that is left of wherever Hermaeus Mora actually came from, before this world or any world like it existed at all. Scholars who have actually examined those bones describe a strange menagerie, a tentacled predator with its mouth set at the center of its own body, worm-like things with mandibles or chitin lining their insides, creatures built only to stick to a wall and wait, and giant nautilus shells that some now believe are the true ancestors of the ordinary nautilus that lives in Tamriel's own waters today. Nobody who cataloged them has ever explained how creatures like that ended up fossilized inside a realm of oblivion instead of on solid ground. He has called himself the first secret ever whispered at the dawn of creation, older than the Aedra themselves, and whether that claim is true or simply the kind of thing an infinitely old, infinitely curious being would say about himself is, like almost everything else about him, left open rather than settled. Sota Sil is next, and what makes him strange has nothing to do with what he could do and everything to do with what he believed, or refused to believe, about himself. He was one of the three living gods of Morrowind, alongside Vivec and Almalexia, known as the clockwork god and the mainspring ever wound, described in the old texts as an architect of time and a binder of oblivion. Two facts about him matter more than any of his titles. The first is that he never actually believed himself to be a god. He knew what had really happened at Red Mountain, knew exactly how the tribunal had come by their power, and privately he didn't think that made him divine in any real sense. Even so, he never once took that belief away from Vivek and Almalexia, who did see themselves as true gods and clearly enjoyed believing it. He let them have it, quietly, for centuries, without ever correcting them. The second fact is stranger still. Sothasil didn't believe in free will, not even his own. He considered himself bound, in some absolute sense, to build the Clockwork City, as though he had never had any real choice in the matter at all. And so he built it, an entire self-contained replica of reality, made of brass and machinery, meant to fix what he saw as the flaws in the Aedra's original creation of Nirn. He built a whole second world because he believed, sincerely, that he had no other option, that this was simply what he was for. A god who doesn't think he is a god, building an entire imitation universe because he can't imagine having any say in the matter, is a strange kind of divine figure to have running one of the largest powers in Morrowind. He was the only survivor of his childhood home, Ald Sota, after the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon destroyed it and killed his whole family. Vivek was the one who saved him. That loss appears to sit underneath everything he did afterward. The drive to destroy the Daedra, the retreat into machinery and prediction, the eventual total withdrawal from the world of mortals and even from his fellow tribunes. He predicted his own death at the hands of Almalexia centuries before it happened, and did nothing to stop it when the day finally came, because, true to his own belief about himself, he didn't think there was anything to be done. Two childhood stories told about him as a boy line up almost too neatly with the god he became. In one, a young Sothasil threw stones at scribs trapped in a mine shaft for his own amusement, until one lifted its head and begged him to stop, telling him that what was sport to him was suffering and death to them. A lesson about how one creature's idle amusement can be another's torture. In another, he spent a whole night as a boy trying to count and name every star in the sky, only to fall asleep and wake to find them gone, which taught him, as the story goes, that time cages every task a person sets for themselves. He carried both lessons into his long life as a god, a discomfort with causing needless suffering, paired with a bone-deep sense that time and circumstance decide everything, and choice decides almost nothing. Even the version of him that shows up in ritual seems to agree with his own self-assessment. During a blessing rite once held at the tribunal temple of Mournhold, a spectral echo of Sothasil called an enigma appeared and described itself, in its own words, as the imperfection of its tribune, cut out of him but never fully separate from him. A god convinced he was flawed produced a ritual copy of himself that introduced itself the exact same way. That same fatalism shows up plainly in a smaller, sadder episode from his own history. A soldier named Luciana Pulo was pulled into his realm gravely wounded, and Sothasil saved her life and delivered her premature son. Years later, when that son developed a fatal heart defect from the very circumstances of his own birth, Luciana forced her way into Sothasil's private chambers to beg him to heal the boy. Sothasil told her plainly that he had the power to save her son, but that circumstances made it impossible, and sent her away. A god who believed in no free will of his own extended that same belief to the people around him, even when it cost a mother her son. His title as a binder of oblivion comes from an actual bargain he struck, not just a poetic description. After Mehrunes Dagon, the same prince who had destroyed his childhood home, later burned down another city in an act of pure rage. Sothasil journeyed into oblivion itself and negotiated a pact with 8 of the most powerful Daedric princes, an agreement still known today as the Cold Harbor Compact, whose exact terms nobody outside that circle has ever fully learned. Months later, when Mehrunes Dagon violated the spirit of that pact by attacking Mournhold, Sothasil confronted him personally, lashed him into submission with whips forged for the purpose, and is said to have whispered Dagon's true, secret name into his ear, a name so dangerous to speak that hearing it made the Prince of Destruction explode across every point in time at once. Whatever the Cold Harbor Compact actually says, the god who wrote it once made an enemy detonate across all of history just by knowing his name. His fixation with removing choice from the world went further than just his own beliefs about himself. Inside the Clockwork City, Sothasil built an entire population of mechanical creatures called factotums and fabricants to run his realm, part machine and, in the fabricant's case, part living flesh, engineered to behave exactly as designed, never choosing anything for themselves. He went further still, trying to store real mortal memories inside one of his earliest machines in the hope of building something with a genuine soul, and the closest he ever got was a convincing imitation, a fully believable lie of a person rather than an actual one. When he later tried transplanting the actual souls of aging temple saints into mechanical bodies to grant them a kind of everlasting life, every single one of them went insane from the process, and his own followers eventually banned the practice outright. A god who didn't believe in free will kept building bodies with no free will built into them at all, and every attempt to sneak a real soul back into one of those bodies ended in madness. Even something as basic as food inside his realm reflects that same total, designed-in absence of choice. Most residents of the Clockwork City live on something called nutriment paste, a thick, flavorless substance dispensed from machines, healthy and filling, but almost entirely without pleasure in the eating of it. Some residents develop a real, named affliction from eating too much of it, called cyclical inert ingestion, and start experimenting with ingesting things that aren't food at all, just for a change in sensation. A small number of people in the realm get to grow and eat real fruit and vegetables instead, from a place called the Everwound Wellspring, at an enormous cost in life force to keep the garden growing at all. Inside a world built by a god who didn't think he had any choices, even the food supply comes down to a design decision nobody living there gets any real say in. Choice runs out even at the front gate. Outsiders who manage to earn citizenship inside the Brass Fortress almost never get to leave again, since the one device that could take them home, the doors of egress, is kept secret from ordinary citizens by the very apostles who use it themselves. Some who end up trapped there consider it a small miracle just to be alive inside a self-contained world at all. Others consider the exact same trap an unending nightmare, and Sothasil's own city was never built to care which one of them turns out to be right. Even his own death didn't stop the work. Sothasil had spent years secretly building a mechanical replacement for the heart of Lorkhan, and he sealed it away safely in the moment Almalexia finally came to kill him, exactly as he had predicted she would. His machines kept building that replacement heart for more than 200 years after his death, with no one left alive to give them any further instructions at all. When it finally finished, decades later, one of Sothasil's own former followers, a man named Messinar who had been cast out for trying to build a perfect life form, came back to seize its power for himself. What happened at the end of that fight isn't agreed upon. One account says the heart was destroyed and the whole city was abandoned once it stopped working. Another says it kept running, fused somehow with the very person who stopped Messinar, who is said to have disintegrated in the process while some part of them lived on inside the machinery anyway. A god who didn't believe he had a choice about anything built a heart that outlived him by centuries, and even now nobody can agree on whether that heart is still beating. Numidium belongs on this list for a simpler reason. It is a machine that keeps acting like a god, and every time anyone actually uses it, time itself comes apart a little. It was built by the Dwemer tonal architect Lord Kagrenac, who intended it to be an entirely new god, powered by the heart of Lorkhan, meant to help the Dwemer retake the land of Resdayn from the Chimer, and possibly grant the whole Dwemer race immortality along the way. That is the plan as far as the sources describe it. How exactly Kagrenac meant to switch the thing on, and what going wrong looked like in detail, is its own story for elsewhere. What matters here is the outcome. The Dwemer vanished from Tamriel completely before Numidium could ever be activated, and more than one source suggests their disappearance may be directly tied to what Kagrenac was trying to do with it. Kagrenac's own actual theory for how the whole thing was supposed to work was written down in a text called Divine Metaphysics, in language so specialized that almost nobody could ever read it properly. One of his own underlings, a Dwemer scholar named Yagrum Bagarn, who ended up outliving the rest of his entire race by centuries, said plainly that he understood Kagrenac's theories well enough, and then just as plainly refused to explain them to anyone else, on the grounds that ideas like that deserved to die out along with the man who had thought of them. The power Kagrenac was tapping has its own strange origin, separate from anything already covered on this list. The heart of Lorkhan is what is left of the god Lorkhan's own divine spark, torn out of his chest by two rival gods after Lorkhan tricked the other spirits into creating the mortal world in the first place. According to the old story, the heart laughed at its attackers and refused to die, since by then it was already bound to the new world. So one of the gods fastened it to an arrow and shot it clean across the sky. It fell to earth like a falling star and landed in what would become Vardenfell, and the impact itself is what formed Red Mountain. Centuries later, that same fallen god's heart is what Dwemer miners found buried under the mountain, and what Kagrenac decided was fit to power a god of his own design. The physical evidence of what happened to the Dwemer themselves is as strange as any theory about it. When one of their untouched cities, Bam-Samshent, was finally rediscovered centuries later, explorers found piles of ash sitting next to weapons and armor, on chairs and in beds, as if every Dwemer body still inside had simply turned to dust wherever it happened to be standing or sitting. The one well-known exception is Yagrum Bagarn, remembered as the last living Dwemer precisely because he happened to be away from Tamriel entirely, off in the Outer Realm, when the rest of his people vanished and came home to find nobody left. Centuries after that, in the year 200, one of the Fourth Era, a College of Winterhold researcher named Arniel Gain tried to recreate the same conditions using keening, one of Kagrenac's actual tools, and he vanished too, in exactly the same way. That is about as strong a piece of evidence as anyone has ever found that whatever Kagrenac did to his own people centuries ago can still happen to somebody else by accident. The machine itself is enormous. It stands 1,000 feet tall, described as a golem or an automaton, depending on who is doing the describing. Centuries after the Dwemer vanished, Emperor Tiber Septim got hold of it and used it to finish his conquest of Tamriel. It was destroyed, then rebuilt again generations later, and that second activation was the direct cause of the event known as the Warp in the West, a moment when the political map of an entire region was reshaped overnight. Every known time anyone has actually switched Numidium on, time itself has warped around the event. That isn't a one-off coincidence. It has happened every single time. One of Solfasil's own Clockwork Apostles described Numidium in terms that make clear just how unnatural the Dunmer considered it, calling it the antipodal god thing that reigned on the darkest pole of the sacred Nirn sphere, and, more bluntly, the welded knot at the center of Anu that must be untied. That isn't the language anyone uses for an ordinary weapon. It is the language people use for something they consider close to an open wound in the structure of reality, one that a Dwemer engineer built with his own hands and then vanished before he ever had to answer for it. Numidium has also picked up nearly as many names over the years as some of the stranger beings already covered on this list. People have called it the Brass God, the Prime Gestalt, the Brass Tower, Walk Brass, Big Walker, Walking Star, and the Divine Skin on top of its official name. A machine isn't supposed to need that many names. Vivek's own writing doesn't even agree with itself about what this machine actually did the first time anyone tried to use it. Sermon 36 of the 36 Lessons, the same cryptic text already mentioned earlier on this list, claims that Kagrenak actually did get his walking star working right there at the Battle of Red Mountain, and that its unleashed power was what tore open the inner sea, needing the tribunal themselves to step in and beat it before the Dwemer could be swept from the world entirely. Every other source, including other things Vivek wrote elsewhere, disagrees with that account completely. Even the god who wrote the book can't get his own story straight about what his own machine did the first time it woke up. Numidium's relationship with broken time goes back further than its own construction. An Aelid archmage once built a set of 8 artifacts, each tied to one of the great metaphysical towers of the world, and one of those pieces matched Numidium's own future shape. Despite being crafted long before Numidium existed to be matched to anything at all, nobody has ever explained how the Archmage knew what he was building toward. And when Numidium was finally reactivated a second time, during the warp in the west, the confusion around it became total. 7 separate rival factions all ended up holding the one artifact needed to control it. At the same time, through what the sources can only describe as some kind of time distortion, and every single one of them activated their own version of the machine simultaneously. The result reshaped the map of an entire region overnight. A 1,000-foot machine built to make a vanished people into gods now has a track record of breaking time itself every time anyone dares to turn it on, whether there is one of it or 7. Numidium wasn't even a one-off design. Centuries after Kagrenak's original was lost, the ash vampire Dagoth-Ur, working from what he could recover of Kagrenak's own notes, started building a second version of the same machine, called Akulakan, using the same heart of Lorkhan as its power source. That second brass god never got the chance to walk. It was stopped in the year 427 of the Third Era, destroyed before it could finish waking up, when the enchantments binding it to the heart were broken for good. Even unfinished and only half-built twice over, the idea behind Numidium has never really stopped tempting people. Something about a machine built to make its makers into gods keeps getting rebuilt, no matter how badly the first attempt ended. Pelinal Whitestrake is next, and here the strangeness isn't about what he was made of. It is about the fact that he doesn't seem to fit inside time the way everyone else does. Pelinal was Alessia's champion during the Alessian Slave Rebellion in the early First Era, the war that threw off Aelid rule over the Nedic people and eventually produced the first Cyrodiilic Empire. The 8 divines gave him the Crusaders' relics, a set of armor and weapons built for him personally, and with them he killed one Aelid sorcerer king after another in single combat. He was also, by every account, dangerous to be near even when he was supposedly on the right side. Legends describe stretches of homicidal madness that came over him, during which he killed without any regard for who stood in front of him and did real damage to the landscape itself in the process, tearing up whole stretches of land in his fury. Alongside Pelinal in that war stood another immortal, a winged bull demigod named Morihaus, son of the goddess Kine, and the two loved each other like family, with Pelinal calling him nephew. Pelinal gave him one piece of plain advice on the subject of mixing divine blood with mortal blood, and the wording of it fits everything else strange about beings on this list who have done exactly that. We are Ada, more, and change things through love. We must take care, lest we beget more monsters on this earth. Morihaus and Alessia had already grown close by that point, and their eventual union is credited, in some of the old accounts, with producing the first Minotaurs. Whether Pelinal's own warning changed anything about how that turned out isn't something any source records. He seemed to resent any suggestion that he was actually divine, despite plenty of evidence pointing that way. When Nordic reinforcements first laid eyes on him during the rebellion, they declared that Sjor, the old Nordic god, had returned in the flesh, and Pelinal reacted with real anger at what he considered blasphemous talk, spitting at the very idea before leading them into battle anyway. That alone would make him a fearsome, complicated hero. What makes him belong on this list is different. Pelinal keeps showing up in the wrong place in time, over and over, in ways the sources don't explain away. During the Alessian Rebellion itself, he is said to have shouted the name of Reman hundreds of years before Reman Cyrodiil was ever born. He was also described, more than once, as wearing armor that belonged to a future time, gear that shouldn't have existed yet by any ordinary reckoning. When his ghost later appeared to a hero long after his death, Pelinal himself couldn't say for certain whether the other figures he had met inside his own strange afterlife dream had come before him or after him. He didn't know the order of his own experiences. And Manimarco, the king of worms, once claimed that Pelinal could account for exactly where he had been during a dragon break, a stretch of broken, non-linear time that occurred roughly 1,000 years after Pelinal had already died. None of these are explained. None of them resolve into a tidy answer about how a dead First Era demigod keeps having alibis for events centuries after his death. They just sit there in the record as things that are said about him. His death, when it came, was brutal and deliberate. Pelinal and the half-elf sorcerer king Umaril the Unfeathered fought each other inside the White Gold Tower, and Pelinal killed him, but not before taking a mortal wound of his own. The surviving Aelid kings, furious at the insults Pelinal had thrown at their bloodline, cut his body into 8 pieces, in direct mockery of the 8 divines who had armed him and carried the pieces away. They left only his head behind, as a kind of gift for Alessia. His fellow demigod Morihaus found that head still alive, kept in torment by Aelid magic, still speaking to whoever would listen, and what it spoke of was regret. There is one more open question hanging over Pelinal, and it deserves to be named honestly rather than resolved for him. He is said to have gone by other names across other ages: Weismer, Harold, Harry Breeks, Hans the Fox, among others. Whether all of those names describe one single being who lived across an impossible stretch of time, or whether they describe several different heroes whose stories simply got tangled together into one composite legend over the centuries, isn't settled in the sources. Both readings exist side by side, and nothing in the record picks between them. The madness that kept overtaking Pelinal had a clear cause in the stories, even if it doesn't make his rampages any less frightening. He loved a woman named Huna, a former grain slave he had raised up himself, and when she was killed by an enemy archer during the rebellion, Pelinal fell apart. His grief turned into rampages so total that he is said to have turned whole stretches of land to void, killing the ground itself along with everyone standing on it, until the gods personally reached down to calm him so that he no longer had the will, in the words used to describe it, to kill the earth in whole. In one of those fits of confused fury, he wandered into Khajiit territory and mistook the catfolk for elves, slaughtering them in numbers before their god Alkosh personally intervened, fought Pelinal, defeated him, and threw him out of the region with a shout powerful enough to tear open what is remembered as a time wound, a scar in the flow of time itself left behind by the fight. Even his victories carry that same time-displaced strangeness. He is remembered as having somehow erased an entire month from the Elvish calendar during the war, a detail no source bothers to explain, and years after his death, he is said to have appeared again, whole enough to speak, at the deathbed of the very queen he had died fighting for. What he told her there is recorded, and it doesn't clear anything up. He spoke of another half that, together with himself, would take her up and reveal their true faces, faces that eat one another in amnesia each age. Nobody has ever explained what that sentence is actually supposed to mean, including the sources that quote it. What was actually underneath Pelinal's armor gets described in language that doesn't sound like an ordinary body at all. He is said to have had a gaping chest with no heart inside it, only a red, rage-shaped diamond that sang like a mindless dragon, and some tellings claim he was formed directly out of a diamond soaked red with the blood of elves, its facets able to unsector and reform into the shape of a man. Whether that description is meant literally or as a kind of mythic shorthand for how unnatural he was is never settled. Either way, it fits a hero who kept turning up in the wrong century, wearing armor that hadn't been built yet, for a war that, by some tellings, he was never entirely present for in the ordinary sense at all. Pelinal's actual death came at the hands of the one enemy built to match him. Umaril, the Unfeathered, was half-elf and half-god himself, granted power by the Daedric Prince Meridia, and knowing he couldn't beat Pelinal in a fair fight, Umaril spent soldiers he knew would die just to wear Pelinal down first, arming them with weapons forged specifically to pierce armor that no ordinary elven blade could touch. Only once Pelinal was already bleeding did Umaril finally step down to fight him directly. Pelinal still killed him. It cost Pelinal his own life in the same exchange. Centuries later, in the Third Era, when Umaril returned from the death Pelinal had given him, it took an entirely new champion, carrying Pelinal's own relics and blessed in his name, to finish what Pelinal himself hadn't been able to make permanent, erasing Umaril's spirit completely, the one true ending Pelinal had died just short of delivering himself. Umaril's own origin is nearly as strange as Pelinal's. He was born to an Aelid mother, but claimed his father was a god left over from the world before this one, which made him a half-elf, half-divine being much like Pelinal was said to be in his own way. Pelinal, in one of his own fits of madness, went further than that. He is recorded claiming that he himself, alongside a being called Akka, had a hand in creating Umaril in the first place. No source treats that claim as reliable, coming from a man raving in the middle of a killing spree, but it sits in the record all the same. A hero who couldn't stay fixed in his own timeline is, by his own raving account, the one who built his own future killer. Even the strangeness of Pelinal's own gear gets a named source. A text called the Song of Pelinal says outright that the Crusaders' relics, the armor and weapons the 8 divines gave him, came from the future, the same claim the record makes about him more generally, without ever fully explaining how. After Umaril's first defeat, scholars fascinated by the fight took to reenacting it using illusion magic built to mimic Umaril's own armor, some tattooing the battle onto their own skin, and worship of Umaril continued, mostly out of sight, in corners of Cyrodiil for centuries afterward, his old war mounts and weapons still being copied and used long after the man himself was supposedly gone for good. Long after Pelinal's own death, mysterious slate-skinned figures began appearing in the Imperial City during moments of Daedric crisis, each one marked with a red diamond set into its chest, fighting off invading Daedra before disappearing again, with no one ever learning where they came from or where they went. Given that Pelinal himself is remembered as having formed out of a diamond shaped by rage, with a diamond in place of a heart, the resemblance is hard to ignore, though no source ever confirms a direct connection between the two. A hero who couldn't stay fixed in his own timeline while he was alive may, if the resemblance means anything at all, still be showing up centuries after his death, wearing a body that isn't quite his own. That brings this list to its last and strangest entry, a being who is, depending on the day, 2 different Daedric princes wearing one body. Long before recorded history, Jyggalag was the Daedric Prince of Order, and his realm of perfect order kept growing, spreading further and further across the seas of oblivion, until the other Daedric princes grew frightened of how powerful he had become, so they cursed him. They didn't curse him with death or with imprisonment. They cursed him with something crueler and more specific. They turned him into the living incarnation of the one thing Jiggalag hated most in all of existence: madness. That curse is where Sheogorath comes from. Not every source agrees on why the other princes actually did it. Followers of Sotha Sil tell a different version. In their telling, the Daedra were never really afraid of power at all. What they fear is wisdom and order, meaning the other prince's real fear was Sotha Sil himself, and Jiggalag simply understood his own nature closely enough to share in that fear, going mad in the act of understanding it. Both versions are still told, and nothing settles which one is closer to the truth. Sheogorath is Jiggalag. He is the same being wearing the opposite of everything Jiggalag stood for, and he doesn't act anything like his other half. Where Jiggalag is described as stern, bleak, and utterly without originality, a being who once kept a library containing the logical prediction of every action anyone would ever take, Sheogorath is chaotic, funny, cruel, and completely unpredictable, ruling over the Shivering Isles, a realm split into a bright half called mania and a dark half called dementia, matching the two shades of his own madness. The curse has one clause that makes it especially cruel. At the end of every era, Jiggalag is allowed to return, however briefly, as his true self, and reconquer his own realm from Sheogorath's madness in an event called the Grey March. Knights of Order rise up out of crystal obelisks, invade the Isles, and slowly retake it piece by piece, until finally Jiggalag himself appears and finishes the job. And the instant he wins, the instant his own realm is his again, he turns back into Sheogorath, and in doing so, undoes the very victory he just won. He wins and loses in the exact same motion, over and over, forever, an ending that erases itself the moment it happens. Sheogorath's reputation for cruelty and strangeness comes from centuries of stories, and a few of them say everything that needs saying about what kind of mind is running that realm. He claims to have spent his first 3,000 or 4,000 years of existence doing nothing but tormenting butterflies before eventually growing bored of it. He is credited with inventing music, using the body parts of a young woman as the instrument. He once sentenced a man to death for the crime of trying to grow a beard. When he fought Hircine, the Daedric prince of the Hunt, he didn't fight him directly at all. He simply let Hircine's own beast maul itself to death and won that way. When he made a wager against Varmina, the Daedric prince of nightmares, he won that one too, by doing absolutely nothing. When he wanted the soul of an orc who had murdered one of his own followers, he didn't collect it himself either. He simply let Malakath handle it, once it turned out the murderer was Malakath's own son. There is a pattern running through every one of those stories, and it is the whole key to understanding Sheogorath. His opponents always defeat themselves. He rarely has to lift a hand. He sets a situation up and steps back and lets pride, hunger, or simple bad judgment do the rest. And that same pattern, it turns out, is exactly what has been happening to him the entire time. Every Grey March, Sheogorath's own other half rises up and beats him, using nothing but the shape of the curse the princes built into him from the start. He has spent every era of recorded history losing to himself, in the same motion as winning, because the trick that always worked on everyone else had been working on him too the whole time, built into his own existence from the beginning. After the most recent Grey March, something changed. The record on this point is plain rather than mysterious. Sheogorath and Jiggalag are no longer described as the same Daedric prince. Whatever the mortal champion who finally broke the cycle actually did in that last confrontation, the ancient loop, win and lose in a single motion, forever, didn't reset itself the way it had every single time before. For the first time in longer than anyone can measure, Jig-Alag walked away from that battlefield as Jig-Alag, not as Sheogorath. The cycle that had been eating itself alive since before recorded history finally stopped. Jig-Alag was never really alone in that particular gift, either. Other beings already covered on this list are said to share some version of the same trick of seeing everything before it happens. Hermaeus Mora reads every path fate could possibly take, and Sotha Sil, back when he was still building his clockwork city, ran detailed simulations of how events would unfold long before they actually did. Even effigies of the dethroned Prince of Order are said to have looked strangely at home inside Sotha Sil's own realm, as if the two of them had always belonged to the same family of mind. Whatever else separated a god of pure order from a god who didn't believe he was a god at all. One relationship inside that cycle says as much about the curse as any of the myths do. Jig-Alag once had a chamberlain named Deus, who handled every part of running the realm that the Prince of Order found beneath him, and who kept a great library holding a logical prediction of every action any creature, mortal or Daedric, would ever take. When Sheogorath took over the realm at the start of each cycle, he burned that library to the ground, calling it an abomination, since he believed personal choice defied logical prediction on principle. But he could never bring himself to destroy Daius himself, or the knowledge Daius carried in his own memory. Instead, Sheogorath forbade Daius from ever dying, and left him locked away for centuries inside the ruins of his own burned library, neither freed nor allowed to end. Even Sheogorath's own chamberlain, a figure named Haskell, is rumored to be the leftover trace of some mortal who mantled the mad god once before, in a past nobody, including Sheogorath, seems willing to discuss in any detail. It was during the final Grey March that a hero of Kuwatch was invited into the Isles specifically to help break the pattern, fighting through obelisks and Knights of Order, taking up the staff of Sheogorath, and ultimately standing in Jig-Alag's way when the transformation came due. Whatever that hero actually did differently from every mortal champion who had come before, it was enough to keep the throne from sitting empty at the one moment when emptiness was all the curse needed to renew itself. Even after that victory, the memory of being Jig-Alag was still something that hurt Sheogorath to touch. Long afterward, in the 4th era, a grieving Dunmer named Talim Rend struck what he thought was a fair bargain with Sheogorath, make him forget his part in the death of his own son, Novos. Sheogorath agreed, and then twisted the deal, leaving Talim convinced he was fighting to cure Novos of madness rather than mourning him, and demanding 3 souls be driven mad in exchange for restoring the boy to sanity. Only after Talim had done everything asked of him did he go home and learn Novos had been dead the entire time. Furious, Talim eventually got his hands on one of Sheogorath's own artifacts, a wand built for scrambling memories, and turned it back on the mad god himself. Forced to relive what it had felt like to be the Prince of Order, Sheogorath begged Talim to stop, in genuine pain, before finally giving the grieving man what he wanted just to make the memories go away again. Whatever it costs to be cursed into becoming the opposite of oneself, forgetting it seems to cost Sheogorath just as much as remembering it ever did. Sheogorath's whole style, letting an opponent talk themselves into losing, shows up in far smaller stories too, long before any of the Grey March drama. Centuries earlier, the Archmage Shalador wagered his own island sanctuary, Ivia, against a book he badly wanted, convinced he could win it back from the mad god easily. He lost, and Evie vanished into the Shivering Isles for thousands of years before anyone managed to negotiate its return. Shalador spent the rest of his life regretting the bet, certain he had been tricked, though nothing about the wager was ever less than fair on paper. That is the same pattern that runs through everything else about Sheogorath. He rarely lies outright and rarely cheats. He just lets people bet more than they can afford to lose, and waits. The realm itself is built to mirror the split running through its ruler. It is divided into 2 halves, a bright, manic northern half and a dark, violent southern half called Dementia, matching what the sources call the two shades of Sheogorath's own madness. Two rival groups of Daedra guard the realm, the Golden Saints and the Dark Seducers, both organized around matriarchal societies that look down on their own males, each serving one half of the split land and competing constantly to become their master's favorite. His most famous weapon fits the same theme of instability, a staff called the Wabajak, which turns anything it touches into something else entirely at random, sometimes a helpless rabbit, sometimes a monster far worse than whatever it used to be. Even his weapon can be counted on to do the same thing twice, which is, in the end, the whole point of the god who made it. None of the other Daedric princes are said to much like Jiggalag either, which makes his curse feel almost like a grudge dressed up as a punishment. Sheogorath himself has put it plainly. Of all the princes, Malakath is more popular at parties, and Malakath isn't popular at parties. Whatever fear or jealousy actually drove the other princes to curse Jiggalag in the first place, none of them appear to have missed him much once Sheogorath took his place. Even the title itself carries a strange kind of history. Sheogorath has described the role of Mad God as something passed down from me to myself every few thousand years, which suggests the hero who eventually replaced Jiggalag as the new incarnation of madness wasn't the first mortal to end up wearing that role either. The realm's own capital, New Sheoth, is split the same way as the rest of the Isles, one half named for the manic side and the other named for the demented one, with Sheogorath's own palace sitting right on the divide between the two, neither fully one nor fully the other, which is about as tidy a picture of the god's own nature as the geography of his realm could possibly give. 15 beings, and by the end of the list, the word being barely holds together anymore. A god split his own face in half rather than pick one side of his people over the other, married a Daedric prince, and still ended up losing his own godhood on purpose. A star looked at the family she came from, decided against following them home, and became a Daedric prince instead. A hero shouted a name that wouldn't exist for centuries, wore armor from a future nobody had built yet, and couldn't tell his own visitors whether they had lived before him or after. And last of all, a Prince of Order grew so powerful that the rest of Oblivion cursed him into becoming the very thing he hated, only to spend every single era winning his own realm back and losing it again in the same breath, until, after countless repetitions, the loop that should have gone on forever simply didn't happen again. None of these are edge cases in the lore. They aren't obscure footnotes kept in a corner because nobody knew where else to put them. Vivec was worshipped by thousands of people every day for centuries. Hermaeus Mora is one of the most active Daedric princes in the entire setting. Numidium ended wars and united the continent. Sheogorath is one of the most recognizable Daedric princes there is. These are load-bearing pieces of Elder Scrolls lore, not strange leftovers, and every one of them still refuses to sit still inside the categories a person would normally expect: person, place, god, idea. That is really the plain thought underneath this whole list. In this world, the line between a person, a place, a god, and an idea was never a solid line to begin with. A star can quit being a star and become a person with a grudge and a realm. A tree can be one mind and also, some of the time, several separate minds, each doing something different. A machine can act like a god and drag time itself out of shape every single time someone dares to switch it on. Somewhere in the middle of all of that sits an ape who had a vision, wrote it down in his own blood, and changed what an entire continent believed. None of it resolves into anything tidier than that. It is just what the world is like once someone starts looking closely enough at the edges of it.